Chairman of the Board, Alex Golan, University President Professor Rivka Karmi, Rector, Professor Tzvia Cohen, friends of the Zlotowski family, and guests, good afternoon and welcome to the annual Zlotowski Lecture. I am Professor Ofer Donchin, head of the Biomedical Engineering Department, and a member of the Zlotowski Center for Neuroscience. We have a particularly special event planned for this afternoon. We are going to begin with presenting the Zlotowski Awards for Outstanding Admitted Students, followed by a lecture titled Insights from Neuroscience and Psychology to Help Our Young People Thrive by Professor Adele Diamond, University of British Columbia, Canada. I want to begin by addressing the recipients of this year's Zlotowski Award. The award is given only to the very best new students at BGU, admitted to BGU, based on an average of their matriculation exam scores and their psychometric exam scores. This year, the award was granted to a total of 136 students. I'm not quite done. These students consistently prove that the award is well-deserved. They've maintained the highest grades at the departmental and faculty levels. They receive additional prizes for outstanding achievements. The percentage of Zlotowski students who pursue graduate degrees is higher than the average at BGU. It's my pleasure to ask the representatives of the students who've come to stand and be recognized. Now it would be great to clap. And now I would like to ask Moshe Boro, a representative of the students, to join me on stage and say a few words.
Professor Rivka Karmi, members of the Board of Governors, and dear friends. My name is Moshe Boro. I'm 24 years old, married to Reut, and live in the town of Sderot. I am proud to be a recipient of the Zlotowski Admission Award for Outstanding Students for 2015, and am honored to represent the 136 students of Ben-Gurion University who received the Zlotowski Award this year. I am a first-year student at the Department of Life Sciences and also take part in a special program called Ashalim. In this program, we study research frontiers in natural sciences and participate in guest lectures by faculty members from our department, exposing us to the most up-to-date and exciting research in the field. I was born in New Jersey, USA. When I was 5 years old, our family made Aliyah to Israel. I grew up in a little town near Modi'in called Nof Ayalon. After high school, I decided to take part in a program called Hesder, enabling soldiers to engage in Jewish studies while serving in the IDF. I wanted to serve in a place where I could contribute to the community and joined the Army program in Sderot, a town in the northern Negev that has suffered massive rocket attacks over the past years. I served as a combat engineer. We took part in many challenging operations, including detonating a live minefield. When I married Reut, we decided to make our home in Sderot. Just by living there in these difficult times, we feel like we are making a difference. We live in a neighborhood with many young couples, many of whom are students at BGU. During Operation Protective Edge, we decided not to leave the area. Together with Reut, who is a member of the emergency team, I ran activities in bomb shelters for local kids whose families had not evacuated the town. We tried to cheer them up and keep them as calm and busy as possible. When I decided to pursue my academic studies, I knew I wanted to study at Ben-Gurion University, to enable me to stay in Sderot and keep living in the Negev, but also because I had heard so much about the high level of academia here. The exceptional research programs, lectures, and labs I take part in all make me realize I've made the right choice. Furthermore, I identify myself with the mandate of the university, which is to develop and promote the Negev region, and I definitely see my future here. In the future, I hope to be accepted to medical school at BGU and become a pediatrician. It has always been my dream to be able to ease the suffering of sick kids. On behalf of all Zlotowski students, I would like to say toda to dear Susie Zlotowski and thank her for her wonderful support to so many students throughout the years. She has let us pursue our dreams at BGU and empowers us to make our own contribution to the world. תודה על הבעת האמון בנו. בזכותך נצליח לעשות שינוי בנגב, במדינה ובעולם. תודה.
Thank you, Moshe. I'm going to proceed to the second half of our event, a lecture by Dr. Adele Diamond, who is one of the recipients of Tamar's honorary doctorate. Dr. Diamond is a neuroscientist, psychologist, and educational innovator, and one of the world's leading researchers in developmental science. Dr. Diamond studies how executive function can be modified by the environment, modulated by genetics and neurochemistry, and become derailed in certain disorders, and also looks for ways that it can be improved by effective programs and interventions. She received her PhD from Harvard in developmental psychology. She was a postdoctoral fellow at Yale, and she received a YWCA Woman of Distinction Award and was named one of the 2,000 outstanding women of the 20th century. Her connection to BGU goes back to the first inaugural Zlotowski lecture, when the Zlotowski family founded the Center for Neuroscience. She was invited here by Professor Avishai Hennick, who has maintained a collaboration, who has maintained a connection with her and continues to collaborate with Professor Nachshon Meron, and has been a supporter of BGU in other ways as well. It is an honor to invite her to the stage to give her talk.
It's a great pleasure to be here. Hi, Avishai. Last year I taught a 4-week course at BGU, and the women in this first slide are some of the students who were in the course. What abilities and skills will be needed to succeed in the 21st century? Well, some of them are self-control, being able to resist temptations and not act impulsively, so that you think before you speak or act, so you don't do something you'd regret, put your foot in your mouth. For example, you may be very upset and you write an email, but maybe you wait before you send it and think better of it. There are many, many examples where if you use self-control, you don't hurt somebody else's feelings and you don't embarrass yourself. Another example of a skill people are going to need is discipline and perseverance. Being able to resist all the temptations not to continue working, because it's difficult, because it's boring, because there are a lot of interesting tangents you'd like to go off on, because there are a lot more fun things to do. Sticking with it, even though the reward might be a long time in coming, like our students will be experiencing. Evidence shows that discipline accounts for over twice as much variation in final grades throughout school, even in university, than does IQ. Being able to control your attention so you inhibit distraction. You don't pay attention to things you don't want to pay attention to and focus on what you want, even if it's boring. Children with better inhibitory control, that is children who are more persistent, less impulsive, and have better attention regulation as little kids, 30 years later as adults, have better health, higher incomes and better jobs, fewer run-ins with the law, and a higher quality of life than their peers who, as little kids, had worse self-control, inhibitory control. And that's true controlling for every variable under the sun. It's based on a study of 1,000 children born in the same city in the same year, followed for 32 years with a 96% retention rate. Unfortunately, I didn't do the study. But the authors conclude interventions that achieve even small improvements in inhibitory control for individuals could shift the entire distribution of outcomes in a salutary direction and yield large improvements in health, wealth, and crime rate for a nation. Another thing our students are going to need is creativity and seeing familiar things in new ways from different perspectives. If one way of solving a problem isn't working, can we reframe the problem and think of it in a different way? Can we come up with a different way of attacking it? Einstein said, if you always do what you always did, you'll always get what you always got. And flexibility, having the flexibility to take advantage of serendipity, having the flexibility to get around unforeseen problems, having the flexibility to admit you were wrong when you get more information. An example of poor cognitive flexibility is given by Alexander Graham Bell. When one door closes, another door opens. but we often look so long and so regretfully upon the closed door that we do not see the ones which open for us. How can we stop ourselves from getting really upset when a child misbehaves? What we usually get upset about is the intent that we think is behind the action. But we can use cognitive flexibility to reframe. A child might be acting in the most awful manner, not because he's a bad kid, but because he's been terribly hurt. And he's going to push you away before you have a chance to push him away. Or he's going to test you to see if you're really somebody he can feel safe with. If we see the misbehavior is coming from hurt, we can react completely differently. Executive functions is shorthand for all of the abilities I just mentioned. It includes inhibitory control, which includes the self-control, discipline, and attentional control I mentioned. It includes working memory, which is holding information in mind and working with it. It's critical for reasoning. And cognitive flexibility, which includes the creative problem solving and flexibility that I mentioned. And from those, higher order executive functions are built, like problem solving, reasoning, and planning. Executive functions are important for every aspect of life. Success in school and in the workplace, making and keeping friends, marital harmony, avoiding things like unplanned pregnancy, substance abuse, or driving fatalities. In other words, self-control, creativity, reasoning, mental flexibility, discipline, and perseverance are really important, and they're often more predictive than IQ. Executive functions depend on prefrontal cortex and the other neural regions with which it is interconnected. Prefrontal cortex is the newest and most vulnerable area of the brain. Prefrontal cortex and executive functions are the first to suffer and suffer the most if you're sad or stressed, if you're lonely, or if you're not physically fit. Conversely, you show better executive functions when you're happy, feel socially supported, and you're physically fit. Our brains work better when we're not in a stressed emotional state, and that's particularly true for prefrontal cortex and executive functions. Stress impairs executive functions and can cause anyone to look as if he or she has an executive function impairment, like ADHD, when that's not the case at all. The person is simply stressed. You may have noticed that when you're stressed, you can't think as clearly or exercise as good self-control. When I'm stressed, I reach for the chocolate. Even mild stress takes prefrontal cortex offline. It increases dopamine in prefrontal cortex so that it floods prefrontal cortex with dopamine. Prefrontal cortex needs dopamine, but it's no good if it gets flooded with it. And you can see here, the dark line is what happens under mild stress. And only in prefrontal do you see this increase in dopamine, not in any of the other regions of the brain. In college students, 1 month of stress in preparation for a major exam disrupts prefrontal cortex functional connectivity and executive functions. When we're sad, we're worse at selective attention. When we're happy, we're better at selective attention. People show more creativity when they're happy. The most heavily researched predictor of creativity in social psychology is mood. The most robust finding is that a happy mood leads to greater creativity. It enables people to work more flexibly and to see potential relatedness among unusual and atypical members of categories. It's not that sadder people are less creative than happier people, but that an individual, within the individual, that person tends to be more creative when he or she is happier than when he or she is more miserable. We all want our children to do well, but if they feel pushed or pressured, if they feel it would be terrible to make a mistake, if they feel they always have to be the best, they always have to get an A or a 90, they'll be stressed. Being stressed is detrimental to our young people doing their best. In other words, they and their parents need to relax. We need to let our young people know it's okay to make a mistake. Everyone makes mistakes. The only alternative is to stay with what you already know to stop growing, right? If you go beyond what you know, you don't know. So you have a 50-50 chance of being wrong. If you want to be sure that you won't make a mistake, the only way to do that is to stay with what you already know and not grow. Einstein said, anyone who's never made a mistake has never tried anything new. When we find we're right, we're not learning anything new. We just learn we were right. It's only when you're surprised, when you were wrong, that you learn something you didn't know before. So my students are always very disappointed when their hypothesis is disconfirmed in an experiment. But I tell them they should rejoice. Now we have the opportunity to learn something we didn't know before. Now we can make a really great discovery. Imperfect is not the same as worthless. Making a mistake is not the worst thing in the world. Even the people we most respect make mistakes and have done things they regret. Each and every one of us is imperfect, yet each and every one of us is wonderful in our own way, though we're all imperfect. The important thing is how you react after you've made a mistake. You've never failed until you've tried for the last time, and you've never lost until you quit. I love that, and I particularly love it because of who said it. Samuel Proctor Macy was born in the segregated South in the early 1900s. You know he encountered a lot of discrimination, setbacks, and failures. Yet he rose to become one of the most highly respected and decorated chemists of the 20th century. You haven't failed till you stop trying. Students are more likely to see something as a welcome challenge, an adventure, rather than an ordeal, if they believe they can succeed. It's important that we communicate loud and clear the faith and expectation that each of our young people will succeed. Goethe said, treat people as if they were what they ought to be, and you help them become what they're capable of being. Toddlers always fall on the way to walking. I've never seen a toddler so fantastic that they get up and walk without ever falling. A toddler may fall 4 or 5 times on a given day. It would never occur to us to say to the toddler on that day, you get a D in walking. We'd never think of it. We always say, don't worry, I'm sure you're going to be able to do this. How different is that from what kids hear in school? They hear you get a D, instead of, there's no question you're going to be able to do this. And we together are going to figure out a way to make that happen. A school in BC, British Columbia, where I am, has as its motto, if you can't learn the way we teach, we'll teach the way you learn. Many of us were taught that people perform better on challenging cognitive tasks when they're slightly stressed, a bit on edge, rather than when you're calm. Many of you may recognize this curve, so that it says that you do better on cognitive tests not when you're calm, but when you're a little aroused, you're a little on edge, okay? That came out in 1903. It's still taught in introductory psychology today. In all of those years, nobody ever thought to study whether it's true of females. It's not. This is an example of a study in animals. It's true that males perform better when they're slightly stressed, absolutely like that curve would say. But the female animals don't need a little stress, thank you very much. They perform fine when they're calm. And under a little bit of stress, they perform worse. They're not dummies. They perform at least as well when they're calm as the males do with a little stress, but stress has opposite effects. Now remember what I told you about mild stress and prefrontal cortex. It selectively increases dopamine in prefrontal. The optimum level of dopamine in prefrontal is an intermediate level. Now let's imagine that maybe females start out with the optimal level of dopamine at baseline, but males start out with a little too little. Now that would be consistent with what I just told you about the effects of stress. So if females start out at the optimal level, they perform great when they're calm. Then you get a little bit of stress, and it moves everybody to have more dopamine in prefrontal, which impairs female performance, but it improves male performance. Now why might females have higher baseline levels of dopamine in prefrontal than males? Well, it turns out that estrogen downregulates transcription of a gene, the COMP gene, that's particularly selectively important for clearing dopamine in prefrontal cortex. Estrogen causes dopamine in prefrontal cortex to be cleared 30% more slowly in women than in men. The COMT enzyme works 30% more slowly in women than in men. So that could cause exactly the dopamine levels that I'm talking about. Females would have higher levels because the dopamine is being cleared more slowly. So here you have the baseline results with what COMP's doing. And here's an example of what you see in monkeys. Here are the males. They weren't given stress this time. They were given a drug which simulates stress. And in this case, the males aren't performing better when they're stressed, but certainly no worse. And the females are performing worse under stress. This is the males, this is the females. Now, look carefully, because this is all females. This is females when their estrogen levels are low. They show exactly the male pattern. And this is the female monkeys when their estrogen levels are high. We predict the same is true in female adult humans, in women. It's only been looked at so far in different species of animals. So in the lab, we're looking now to see if we can replicate in humans what's been shown so many times in the animals. Throughout the school years, girls earn higher grades than boys in most subjects at all grade levels, but boys tend to outperform girls on standardized tests, right? That's consistent with what I'm telling you about stress. Standardized tests tend to be high-risk occasions where there's more stress. You're worried about doing well on this exam that matters so much. That's going to help the boys and not help the girls. Standardized tests put women at a selective disadvantage because in general, females are more adversely affected by mild stress than males. And the stress is not only at the exam, but in the weeks leading up to it. Such tests are also likely to impair teachers' ability to teach because teachers will be stressed and many teachers are female. And we're not just intellects and emotion, we're also social beings. Our brains work better when we're not feeling lonely or socially isolated. And that's particularly true for prefrontal cortex and executive functions. One group of researchers did some tabulation with subjects' results, and they said to one group of subjects, we can tell you guys are going to have close relationships throughout your lives. They told another group of subjects the opposite, and a third group of subjects unrelated bad news. On simple memorization questions that don't require executive functions, all three groups perform comparably. But on logical reasoning that requires executive functions, those told to expect that they'd be lonely perform worse. Other researchers haven't tried to manipulate this. They'll give subjects a survey when they come in the lab, and embedded in the survey will be questions like, do you feel lonely? Do you feel socially supported? And one group found that subjects who report that they feel lonely show less efficient prefrontal cortex activation. We are fundamentally social. We need to belong, we need to fit in and be liked. Children who are lonely or ostracized will have more difficulty learning. And it's not just peers. A close relationship with a caring adult can be huge. Melhus looked at what makes for the good early childhood education around the world. He got the data from all the countries of the world, and he looked at what variable matters most. What matters most is not the number of children, it's not the adult-child ratio, and it's not the quality of the materials. It's not that they don't matter, but they're not the variable that matters most. The variable that matters most is the relationship between the adults and the children. You probably know that if a family is poor, if they're lower socioeconomic status, they're predicted to have all kinds of worse outcomes. Their child will probably not do as well in school, will probably have worse health, will probably have behavior issues. But it turns out that if the child is lucky enough to have a great mother, to have really good nurturing, that totally wipes out the effect of SES. Totally wipes it out. And Michael Meany has shown the same thing in rats. He has strains of rats genetically bred so that one strain tends to be stressed and not so smart, and another strain tends to be calm in the face of stress and smarter. And then he cross-fostered the baby rats to the different mothers. And the baby rats who were inclined to be easily stressed and not so smart, when they had the terrific mothering of the other mother rats, grew up to be adults who were calm in the face of stress and smarter. And rats tend to mother the way they were mothered, so this translates intergenerationally. It's a behavior that affects gene expression and gets translated across the generations. This is an example of the data in humans. This is lower SES, lower socioeconomic status, and the pale yellow is the average, not such great mothering. And if you have a double whammy of being poor and not having great mothering, you look terrible on behavior problems. But if you're lucky enough to have fantastic mothering, look at how it wipes out the effect of SES. The blue lines here are just about as low as you see for the wealthy kids. The same is true for physicians and psychotherapists. Jerome Frank in the 1960s did a study to try to determine which is the best form of psychotherapy. Is it Rogerian, psychoanalysis, cognitive behavior, all the different kinds? And to his great chagrin, it didn't matter a twit which kind of therapy the clinician thought he was practicing. What mattered was the relationship between the clinician and the patient. If the patient felt cared about, the patient tended to get better. Jerome Frank concluded that a totally untrained therapist who exercises a great capacity to love will achieve psychotherapeutic results equal to the best. 40 years later, Bruce Walpole did the same sort of study and came up with the same conclusion. Client-therapist relationship trumps technique hands down. Whether you're a teacher, parent, doctor, or therapist, your humanity is more important than your knowledge or skill or doing the textbook perfect thing. People who make a difference in your life are not the ones with the most credentials, the most money, or the most awards. They're the ones who care. In a recent analysis of student outcomes worldwide, this is grade school children, the two countries that came out on top were Finland and South Korea. And that's consistent with what other research has found. Well, what do Finland and South Korea have in common? Not a lot. But what they have in common is the standards for getting into teacher training at university are extremely high. They're so high that the rejects who didn't get into teacher training go into what I do. They go into research. The respect for teachers is enormous, and teachers are paid extremely well. So think about it. To get the best student outcomes, Israel as a society needs to attract the best and the brightest to go into teaching, and you need to respect and appropriately compensate teachers. We're not just intellects, emotions, and social, we also have bodies. You need your sleep. Lack of sleep will make you look like you have an executive function impairment like ADHD. When you don't, you're simply sleepy. People who are more physically active have better aerobic fitness and better motor coordination, flexibility, and balance, show better executive function performance. The brain doesn't recognize the same sharp division between cognitive and motor that we impose in our thinking. The same or substantially overlapping brain systems subserve both cognitive and motor function. For example, an area of the brain called the pre-SMA is important for sequential tasks. And it doesn't matter whether they're sequential cognitive tasks or sequential motor tasks. Motor development and cognitive development appear to be fundamentally intertwined. Executive functions can be improved at any age, from early infancy through old age. There are three basic ways to improve functioning that requires executive functions. One is to work directly on executive functions and train them and challenge them. Another way is to work on reducing things that impair them, like stress or lack of sleep. And a third way is to find ways around needing to use so much executive function, to reduce the demands on executive function. And that's no disgrace. Executive functions require a lot of effort. If you can reduce the effort you're spending on that, you have more effort for other things. So why not write notes to yourself instead of trying to remember everything? Why not put the cookies in a jar that you can't see through instead of a clear glass jar? There's no reason to make things harder for yourself. Many different activities have been shown to improve executive functions, including computerized training, games, aerobics, traditional martial arts, yoga, mindfulness, and certain school curriculum. Contrary to influential reviews on the benefits of aerobic exercise, which claim that aerobic exercise improves memory and cognition and executive functions, it doesn't. Exercise without a cognitive component, and perhaps without a social component, for example, riding a stationary bike or running on a treadmill, produces little or no cognitive benefit, period. Lots of studies have shown this. Exercise alone appears not to be as effective in improving executive functions as exercise plus character development, like traditional martial arts, exercise plus mindfulness, like yoga, and other exercise that requires thought, like soccer. And what I'm going to talk about now is discussed in much greater detail in this science paper. Lakes and Hoyt randomly assigned children in grades kindergarten through 5th grade either through traditional Taekwondo or standard phys ed. Those assigned to traditional Taekwondo showed greater gains than children in standard phys ed on all dimensions of executive function they studied. This generalized to multiple contexts and was found on multiple measures. Now, traditional martial arts emphasize character development, respect, self-control. You're not supposed to your first inclination is to want to go in there and attack. But you're not supposed to do that in traditional martial arts. You're supposed to inhibit that tendency. Use self-control. So you wait for the opportunity. You wait for your opponent to be slightly off balance, and now you go in. Okay, so it's training executive functions. In a study with adolescent juvenile delinquents, one group was assigned to traditional Taekwondo. The other group was assigned to modern martial arts. Martial arts only as a physical activity, only as a competitive sport. Nothing about self-control or waiting before you attack. Those in traditional Taekwondo showed less aggression and anxiety and improved in social ability and self-esteem, whereas those in modern martial arts showed more juvenile delinquency and aggressiveness and decreased self-esteem and social ability. Whether gains are seen depends on the way an activity is done. Executive function training appears to transfer, but the transfer is not wide. Computerized working memory training improves working memory, but not other executive functions like self-control, creativity, or flexibility. People improve on the skills they practice, and that transfers to other contexts where those same skills are needed, but people only improve on what they practice. Improvement doesn't transfer to other skills. To see widespread benefits, diverse skills have to be practiced. Because of that, real-world activities like martial arts or certain school curricula that train diverse executive function skills have been shown to have more widespread benefits than targeted training. Executive functions need to be continually challenged to see improvements, not just used, but challenged. The importance of repeated practice. Whether gains are seen depends on the amount of time spent practicing, working on the skills, pushing oneself to improve. Prefrontal cortex, the area of the brain I specialize in, is overrated. To learn something new, we need prefrontal cortex. But after something is no longer new, the people who perform best often use prefrontal least. This is an example from a very early fMRI study in the 1990s. It's a task that activates prefrontal cortex. And some subjects show activation on both sides. Some subjects more on one side, some subjects more on the other. That's normal individual variation, no problem. But 2 subjects didn't show prefrontal activation at all. This is Ruth Brigida and Kathy O'Craven, my colleagues, my collaborators on the study. And because they were familiar with prefrontal activation, because they were familiar with the task, prefrontal activation dropped out. When something's new, those who recruit prefrontal most usually perform best. But when you're really good at it, you're not usually using prefrontal so much. We want most tasks to be so familiar and well-learned that prefrontal cortex is not needed. You want those tasks to be handed off to older brain regions that have had so much more time to perfect their functioning and can do things so much better than can prefrontal. A child may know intellectually at the level of prefrontal that he shouldn't hit another, but in the heat of the moment, he hits the other. But if you ask him right afterwards, should you hit? He says no, he knows you shouldn't hit. It's the difference between knowing something at an intellectual level, at the level of prefrontal, and having it be second nature or automatic. The only way something becomes automatic, becomes passed off from prefrontal, is through action, repeated action. Nothing else will do. And Aristotle realized this back in the 4th century BC. We are what we repeatedly do. Excellence, then, is not an act, but a habit. We don't act rightly because we have virtue or excellence, but we rather have these because we've acted rightly. These virtues are formed in a person by doing the actions. We are what we repeatedly do. The importance of action for learning, learning through doing. If I asked any of you who's going to learn the route better, the driver or the passenger in the car, all of you know the answer and all of you know why. The driver has to pay attention to the route in order to get there. The passenger's passively sitting there, not paying much attention, not learning it so well. We learn something when we need it for what we want to do. That's how we evolved. So we need to give children in school some reason to need the information we want them to learn. They need to use it. They have to use it. Otherwise, they won't learn it so well. Right? My son gave me a brilliant lecture on how to program the VCR. It was clear, it was elegant, it was gorgeous. A week later, when I went to program the VCR, could I do it? No, because I hadn't listened the week earlier with the mindset of really using the information. We all know this. So why is so much of schooling still didactic instruction instead of hands-on? The students sit like you, right, passively listening, and the teacher is up here learning it very well. Doesn't make sense. There are many things one can strive to be good at, but the most important is to be a good person, a mensch. How can we structure education so that we graduate students who are good human beings, compassionate, kind, and ethical? The Dalai Lama said, if you want others to be happy, practice compassion. And that makes sense to just about everybody. But he also said, if you want to be happy, practice compassion to others. And that doesn't always make sense, especially the little kids. For young people to understand the deep truth of, if you want to be happy, practice compassion to others, they need to practice compassion and see for themselves how happy it makes them when somebody else smiles because of something they did. Intellectually, just in the abstract, this will never make sense unless you experience it. Rabbi Abraham Heschel said, the act teaches us the meaning of the act. Absolutely right. Remember the quote from Aristotle, if students act as if they are good, they will become good. The way to produce compassionate young people is to have them repeatedly practice even small acts of compassion. Service activities, activities where the students are working to help their community or people elsewhere. It could be earthquake victims in Nepal. It could be local family whose house was demolished. It doesn't matter. These activities, wait a minute, I'll come back to these activities. I predict that the activities that will most successfully improve executive functions will not only work directly on training and improving executive functions, but will also indirectly support executive functions by lessening things that impair them and enhancing things that support them. So this is a fancy diagram which says exactly what I just said in more simple words. The program should directly train executive functions and indirectly help them by increasing joy, reducing stress, improving physical fitness, giving better feelings of social support and belonging, and building confidence and pride. And service activities do all of that. More important than service activities helping academic achievement, they're important because of the training they provide in being a good person. Research shows that what brings people the most happiness is not money or creature comforts, but rather feeling that what you're doing has meaning, that it benefits others. Happiness runs in a circular motion. Often what makes us happiest is making others happy. Being kind to others is not only good for others, it's good for the doer. It's the best route to genuine happiness and better health. Thank you very much.